In the aftermath of the Second World War, millions clung to the belief that the full truth of those years had been revealed through trials, testimonies, and historical accounts. But behind locked steel doors and sealed archives, another reality was buried. A reality too disturbing to be acknowledged, too corrosive to the fragile alliances that shaped the post-war order. Files stamped with the words, "most secret," "eyes only," and "do not release" tell stories that were never meant to see daylight. Inside them lie accounts of atrocities excused in the name of science, forbidden pacts between faith and fascism, massacres deliberately erased to preserve fragile diplomacy, and covert experiments conducted not on enemies, but on loyal soldiers. These classified documents were not destroyed, only hidden, waiting in silence for decades until fragments began to surface through accidental leaks, Cold War defections, and the declassification orders of cautious governments. Each file bears not just ink and paper, but the weight of suppressed truth. Truths that expose a darker side to victory and complicity. Tonight, as we open these disturbed World War II secrets buried deep within classified archives, we step into a shadow history, one that undermines the very narrative of good versus evil. What follows are 5 cases deliberately concealed, 5 truths erased from memory, 5 forbidden files that demand to be heard despite every attempt to silence them. Listen closely, for these are the voices of the buried past, resurfacing at last from the archives of secrecy. Chapter 1. The classified atrocity of Unit 731, hidden within the frozen landscapes of Manchukuo, in a fortress-like compound outside the city of Harbin, stood one of the most secretive and horrific installations of the Second World War. Officially, it bore the innocuous designation of the Epidemic, Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. In reality, it was Unit 731, a covert biological warfare research and development facility commanded by General Shiro Ishii. To the outside world, Ishii was a medical doctor and military innovator. Inside the compound's gates, however, he presided over systematic human experimentation that defies comprehension. The archives, when opened decades later, revealed that the men, women, and children imprisoned within its walls were not seen as human beings, but as expendable material, referred to coldly in logs as maruta, meaning logs. These were prisoners of war, Chinese civilians accused of resistance, Korean nationals, and occasionally Soviet captives, all stripped of identity and condemned to be subjects in a campaign of weaponized science. The experiments followed military precision. Reports describe entire groups of prisoners deliberately infected with anthrax, plague, and cholera so that scientists could observe the incubation period and lethality. The records are chillingly detailed. Temperatures noted every hour, the progress of necrosis carefully charted, organs harvested upon death. In some cases, prisoners were vivisected without anesthesia so that organs could be removed while still functioning, their conditions meticulously documented by surgeons in white coats. Others were tied to stakes in open fields and bombarded with plague-infested fleas released from clay bombs. The data later used to design ceramic weapon casings. Frostbite experiments were equally ruthless. Victims had limbs plunged into icy water or exposed to the Manchurian winter until flesh froze solid. Ishii's staff would then attempt various treatments, often amputating blackened tissue while patients remained alive, simply to record the limits of human endurance. Unit 731 was not an isolated program. Documents link it with auxiliary units scattered across occupied China, each performing parallel studies. Unit 100 near Changchun specialized in animal-to-human disease transmission, while Unit 516 in Qikihar focused on chemical weapons. Collectively, they formed a clandestine network of death laboratories under the Kwantung Army's command. Estimates suggest more than 10,000 men, women, and children perished in these facilities, their deaths hidden beneath code names and statistical charts. Yet perhaps the most disturbing secret is not only the crimes themselves, but what happened after Japan's surrender. One might expect the leaders of Unit 731 to stand trial alongside Nazi doctors at Nuremberg. Instead, the archives reveal a different fate, one orchestrated by the United States government under the shadow of the emerging Cold War. In 1947, American intelligence officers operating under directives tied to Operation Paperclip negotiated a deal with General Ishii and his subordinates. In exchange for immunity from prosecution, the scientists would hand over all their research data on biological warfare. Internal memoranda uncovered in 1989 show high-ranking officials justifying the decision on the grounds of strategic necessity, arguing that the Soviet Union must not gain access to the same information. Payment was not made in money but in freedom. Ishii lived quietly in Japan until his death in 1959, never standing trial. His data, however, was absorbed into classified US Army programs at Fort Detrick, Maryland, where it formed the backbone of America's biological warfare efforts during the early Cold War years. This bargain left a permanent scar on history. Survivors who tried to speak out were dismissed, their testimonies buried under official denials. Families of victims never received acknowledgement, let alone justice. When Japanese courts were petitioned decades later for recognition, government officials claimed no evidence remained, pointing to lost or destroyed records. Yet scattered files recovered from Soviet archives, combined with oral histories from former staff, provide undeniable proof. They confirm the dropping of plague bombs on Ningbo in 1940, the release of cholera into Chinese water supplies, and the grotesque medical logs of individual test subjects reduced to case numbers. The physical site of Unit 731 in Harbin was demolished by retreating Japanese forces in 1945, but fragments remained, ruined foundations, shattered glass vials, and the haunting presence of buried bones discovered by locals in later decades. Today, a museum stands on the site, displaying rusted surgical tools and copies of declassified Allied documents. But the full weight of truth remains hidden in vaults across Tokyo and Washington, sealed behind walls of classification. The sanitized version of history says Japan's wartime doctors were punished, yet the reality is more ambiguous. Men like Masaji Kitano, a senior figure in Unit 731, later became head of Japan's largest pharmaceutical company. Others assumed respected academic positions, their past erased by the needs of geopolitics. The legacy of Unit 731 is therefore not just one of atrocity, but of complicity. It illustrates how governments, in pursuit of advantage, can knowingly conceal crimes against humanity. The documents that survived are stained not only with the suffering of those who perished, but also with the signatures of Allied officers who chose secrecy over justice. Each logbook, each coded cable, each immunity order tells a story not of healing, but of betrayal. The silence was not accidental, it was orchestrated. The victims of Unit 731 were denied their place in the world's memory so that nations might wield their torment as weapons of strategy. To hear these accounts is to confront a disturbing paradox. Victory in the Second World War is often told as the triumph of morality over barbarism. Yet hidden within the classified archives lies a different truth, that even victors bartered with evil when it suited their needs. Unit 731 remains the darkest symbol of that trade, a secret long denied, buried under layers of denial and censorship. The declassified fragments we possess are only glimpses, but they are enough to reveal a chilling certainty. Behind every redacted line, every missing file, there is a story of human suffering deliberately concealed. And that concealment was itself a crime, one that extends the shadows of Unit 731 far beyond the end of the war, casting doubt on the integrity of those who claim to stand for justice. Chapter 2: Forbidden Pact. Beneath the Vatican walls. The Second World War has often been framed as a conflict of absolute moral clarity, an existential battle between tyranny and freedom, darkness and light. Yet within the sealed archives of the Vatican lies a story that undermines that narrative, a hidden correspondence suggesting that one of the world's most revered spiritual institutions entered into a secret understanding with the very regime it publicly condemned, codenamed Concordat Black. In declassified intelligence intercepts, this clandestine agreement bound the Vatican and Nazi Germany in a pact that blurred the line between neutrality and complicity. While the 1933 Reichskonkordat between the Holy See and Hitler's government was already a subject of controversy, the files uncovered decades later point to a far darker arrangement. One designed not for public proclamation but for secrecy, one that ensured the survival of institutional power even as millions perished across Europe. The surviving documents describe confidential meetings held in Rome during the tense summer of 1942. Envoys of the German Reich, cloaked as cultural attachés, entered the Apostolic Palace under cover of night. Within heavily guarded chambers beneath the Vatican Library, they met with high-ranking clerics whose names remain redacted in the surviving files. Intelligence reports from the OSS note that coded telegrams were transmitted through neutral Swiss channels, indicating that Reich gold looted from Jewish families and occupied territories was being funneled into Vatican-linked accounts in Switzerland and Italy. This money, cleansed through complex transactions and protected by banking secrecy, emerged in post-war years as investments used to sustain clerical institutions. Official Vatican records describe these transfers as charitable donations. Declassified intelligence, however, labels them as the laundering of blood, money. Even more disturbing is the evidence, pointing to the Vatican's role in the infamous rat lines, the clandestine, escape routes used by Nazi officers and collaborators in the immediate aftermath of Germany's defeat. Files held by British MI5 and American CIC detail how priests provided shelter and false identity papers to fleeing SS officers, often under the guise of humanitarian aid to displaced persons. Baptismal certificates were altered to disguise German surnames, while monasteries near the Italian border acted as way stations on the path to South America. Argentina, under Juan Perón, became a favored destination. The Vatican's official stance was one of compassion for refugees. Yet buried correspondence between clerical officials and Argentine consuls reveals deliberate coordination, smoothing the passage of men like Adolf Eichmann and Klaus Barbie, architects of genocide whose safe arrival overseas was anything but accidental. The motivations behind this forbidden pact remain contested. Defenders argue that Vatican officials feared communist expansion and saw the protection of Nazis as a lesser evil in the fight against Soviet atheism. Others suggest financial gain, institutional survival, and the preservation of the Church's influence in a world rapidly descending into chaos. Whatever the rationale, the consequences are undeniable. War criminals escaped justice, looted wealth found protection, and the moral authority of a sacred institution was compromised behind closed doors. Allied intelligence knew of these activities, but often chose silence. Reports indicate that the OSS, and later the CIA, valued the Vatican's intelligence network in Eastern Europe, which relied on priests and missionaries for first-hand reports of communist activities. Confronting the Vatican risked losing that network, and so silence prevailed. Inside the Vatican archives, many files remain sealed, protected under papal secrecy laws that restrict access for 75 years or longer. What has emerged comes from defectors, leaks, and fragments declassified by Allied governments. One document, dated November 1944, describes a meeting between Vatican representatives and emissaries of SS General Karl Wolff, during which safe passage for certain officers was discussed in exchange for information on Soviet troop movements. Another memo, labelled Eyes Only and originating from the British Foreign Office, warns of the disturbing willingness of ecclesiastical authorities to shield Axis personnel under the guise of humanitarian relief. Such warnings were never acted upon, buried under layers of diplomatic caution. The physical setting of these negotiations is itself chilling. The underground vaults of the Vatican, lined with centuries-old manuscripts, became the stage for secret handshakes and whispered agreements. Oil lamps cast flickering shadows on marble floors as men in cassocks and Nazi uniforms discussed matters never meant for daylight. Outside, Rome starved under occupation and Allied bombing raids shook the city. Inside, the machinery of survival, finance and escape was quietly put into place. This juxtaposition, sacred walls sheltering profane deals, remains one of the war's most haunting images. The post-war silence was deliberate and strategic. The Vatican, shielded by diplomatic immunity and spiritual authority, faced little external scrutiny. The Nuremberg trials never probed its role. Western governments, focused on rebuilding Europe and containing Stalin, avoided confrontation. Survivors of the Holocaust, who tried to trace stolen family assets, often found themselves blocked by bank secrecy, their claims dismissed by institutions unwilling to reveal the Vatican's involvement. For decades, the narrative of neutrality persisted, reinforced by official statements of sorrow and condemnation, while the darker truths remained locked away. Only in the late 20th century did cracks begin to appear. Journalists uncovered fragments of financial records linking Nazi gold to Vatican accounts. Former intelligence officers testified to wartime negotiations they had monitored, but been ordered to suppress. In 1998, under mounting international pressure, the Vatican opened limited inquiries into its wartime role, issuing statements of regret, but carefully avoiding full acknowledgement. The The Forbidden Pact remains, even now, more shadow than substance. Its outlines suggested by declassified fragments, its full contents buried beneath papal locks. The moral weight of these revelations is immense. A spiritual institution that claimed to stand above politics had entangled itself with one of history's darkest regimes. The choice to protect wealth and influence, to shield fugitives and launder their spoils, raises questions that extend beyond wartime Rome. How much truth can be sacrificed in the name of survival? How far can neutrality stretch before it becomes complicity? The documents do not answer these questions. They merely pose them, their ink still carrying the gravity of betrayal. And as long as the Vatican's deepest vaults remain sealed, the complete story of Concordat Black will remain one of history's most disturbing secrets, forbidden not by time, but by deliberate concealment. Chapter 3. Erased Soviet Massacres in the East. Among the most unsettling files to surface from Soviet archives after 1991 were those labeled with the designation 482K. These were not German documents, nor Allied reports, but original NKVD orders and internal memoranda, chronicling mass executions carried out under Joseph Stalin's regime during the early years of the war. The most notorious of these crimes, now known as the Katyn Forest Massacre, remained hidden beneath layers of lies and deliberate falsification for half a century. Yet Katyn was only one among several coordinated massacres, collectively designed to eradicate the very heart of the Polish nation, its officers, intellectuals, and civic leaders, before they could form the nucleus of resistance against Soviet domination. The truth, once buried in sealed archives and denied at every turn, is now emerging as a portrait of deliberate state-sponsored annihilation. In the spring of 1940, following the Soviet invasion of eastern Poland in September 1939, approximately 22,000 Polish prisoners of war were transported from camps in Kozelsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov. They were officers, professors, doctors, lawyers, priests, representatives of the nation's educated elite. NKVD records reveal that their names were compiled into execution lists, each signed off by Lavrenti Beria, head of the secret police, and ultimately approved by Stalin himself. The orders were chillingly specific. Prisoners were to be shot individually in the back of the head, their bodies disposed of in mass graves, and the operation conducted with absolute secrecy. At Katyn Forest near Smolensk, truckloads of men were led at night to secluded pits. Autopsy reports later uncovered by German forces in 1943 would show entry wounds at the base of the skull, the signature method of NKVD executions. Yet Katyn was not the only site. Parallel massacres occurred in Kalinin, now Tver, where thousands from the Ostashkov camp were executed and buried in Mednoy, and in Kharkiv, where prisoners from Starobelsk were killed and interred in mass graves at Piatikatki. Smaller execution sites stretched across Soviet-occupied territory, forming a hidden geography of slaughter. The Soviet state meticulously covered its tracks. Death certificates were falsified. Families told that their loved ones had been sentenced to labor. Files were stamped top secret and locked away in NKVD vaults, their existence denied at every level of government. When German troops uncovered the graves at Katyn in April 1943, they seized the discovery as propaganda, inviting international commissions to examine the bodies. German forensic experts documented uniforms, personal items, and diaries, many bearing dates ending in 1940, long before German occupation of the region. Yet when the Soviet Union recaptured the area, it launched an aggressive campaign of disinformation. Soviet investigators claimed that the massacres had been committed by the Wehrmacht in 1941, and this narrative was presented at the Nuremberg trials despite Allied skepticism. American and British intelligence possessed evidence suggesting Soviet responsibility, including intercepted communications and reports from the Polish government in exile. Churchill and Roosevelt, however, chose silence, fearing that accusing Stalin would fracture the Grand Alliance at a critical stage of the war. Declassified MI6 memoranda reveal that British officials deliberately suppressed reports from escaped Polish officers, instructing them to maintain public silence for the sake of wartime unity. For Polish survivors and families, this silence was devastating. Decades passed with no acknowledgement, their grief compounded by official denials and propaganda. Within Soviet-controlled Poland, speaking of Katyn as a Soviet crime was itself a punishable offense. Textbooks, newspapers, and public commemorations all reinforced the lie of Nazi culpability. Generations grew up with a falsified memory, while those who privately remembered the truth carried it as forbidden knowledge. Only after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 did Moscow officially admit responsibility, releasing portions of Beria's execution orders and Stalin's signed approvals. Yet even today, many original files remain classified, their full contents redacted or withheld, fueling suspicion that the scale of the massacres extended beyond what is officially acknowledged. The Katyn case illustrates not only the brutality of the executions, but also the power of erasure. For half a century, an entire crime was deliberately inverted. Perpetrators disguised as victims, victims accused as collaborators. The politics of memory proved as ruthless as the executions themselves. Western complicity in this erasure raises equally disturbing questions. What did Allied leaders know, and when? Declassified OSS documents suggest that Roosevelt was briefed in 1944 by his ambassador in Moscow, Avril Harriman, who reported credible evidence of Soviet guilt. Churchill himself admitted privately to Polish officials that the Soviets were likely responsible, but he urged silence, remarking that truth is a luxury in wartime. Such statements reveal the grim calculus of diplomacy, where moral outrage was subordinated to the necessity of defeating Hitler. Today, memorials at Katyn, Mednoye, and Piatikatki stand as solemn reminders, but the silence that surrounded them for decades remains part of the wound. The exhumed bodies, their hands bound, their documents still in pockets, testify more truthfully than any official statement. The files marked 482K confirm what families always knew, that their fathers, brothers, and sons were not lost in battle, but executed in secrecy, their deaths concealed by a state determined to erase accountability. Each stamped page and each coded signature preserved in the archives is both a record of atrocity and a monument to the fragility of truth. In an age of propaganda, the Soviet massacres in the East are thus more than an episode of wartime brutality. They are a study in how power manipulates memory, how alliances distort justice, and how victims can be killed twice, once by bullet and once by silence. The declassified fragments that survive expose only part of the full picture. Many files remain sealed, many questions unanswered. Yet the evidence is enough to reveal a disturbing reality. Even as the world rallied against fascism, another form of terror was at work behind Soviet lines, its victims written out of history until the collapse of the very regime that murdered them. The truth of Katyn and its sister massacres, long erased, remains one of the most disturbing secrets of the Second World War, buried deep in the classified archives of a state that built its power on denial. Chapter 4: Hidden Chemical Tests on Allied Soldiers. Among the declassified War Office files released in fragments during the late 20th century lies a disturbing revelation. Thousands of Allied soldiers, many of them British conscripts, were unknowingly used as human test subjects in chemical warfare experiments conducted during the Second World War. The files were stamped with the chilling words, "most secret," Porton-Down trials, and for decades, the truth was locked away from public view under the Official Secrets Act. What they reveal is not a story of brave defense against enemy weapons, but of betrayal by one's own government, a cold calculation in which loyal servicemen were treated as expendable instruments of science. Porton-Down, a secluded research facility in Wiltshire, England, had been established in 1916 during the First World War as a response to the horrors of chlorine and mustard gas unleashed on the Western Front. By the outbreak of the Second World War, it had grown into a sprawling compound hidden behind barbed wire and secrecy, devoted to the research and development of chemical and biological warfare. Between 1941 and 1945, over 3,000 servicemen passed through its gates, many under the impression that they were participating in routine training exercises or contributing to defensive studies. In reality, they were exposed to lethal substances including mustard gas, lewisite, phosgene, and even experimental nerve agents. Their reactions were meticulously recorded in clinical detail, while their pain and long-term suffering were dismissed as classified injuries. The experiments were carried out with bureaucratic efficiency. Soldiers were ordered into sealed gas chambers and instructed to remove their respirators at timed intervals. the level of exposure carefully controlled by scientists in protective suits watching from behind glass panels. Others were subjected to patch tests, in which drops of liquid blister agents were applied to their bare skin to measure the speed and severity of chemical burns. Reports describe subjects collapsing in agony, eyes swollen shut, skin erupting into blisters, lungs seared by invisible toxins. Yet the language of the official records is detached, reducing human torment to phrases like moderate erythema or severe vesiccation. One particularly harrowing program was tied to Operation Vegeteer, a top-secret Anglo-American initiative aimed at weaponizing anthrax for use against German agriculture. Gruinard Island, a remote stretch off the Scottish coast, was chosen as the testing ground. Bombs filled with anthrax spores were detonated over tethered sheep, their carcasses studied as the disease spread. The island became so contaminated that it remained quarantined for nearly 50 years, a permanent scar of wartime experimentation. Documents suggest that Porton Down scientists seriously considered deploying anthrax bombs over German fields to devastate food supplies, a plan halted only by the war's rapid end. While the livestock bore the immediate brunt of this testing, Allied soldiers bore another. Many were deliberately exposed to anthrax vaccines and experimental countermeasures, their long-term health outcomes never fully recorded. The secrecy surrounding these tests was ironclad. Servicemen were bound by orders not to disclose their participation, and many were told that speaking out would constitute treason. Medical complaints were dismissed or attributed to unrelated conditions, with records stamped classified to prevent outside doctors from investigating. Some veterans reported developing chronic respiratory illness, skin disorders, and even cancers later in life, but their pleas for recognition were ignored. Only in the 1990s did a handful of cases finally surface in British courts, where survivors described in sworn testimony how they had been coerced into experiments without informed consent. Even then, official acknowledgement was partial, carefully worded to avoid admissions of liability. What makes these revelations all the more disturbing is the knowledge that they were not isolated to Britain. American and Canadian archives reveal parallel experiments conducted on their own servicemen, often in coordination with Porton Down. Declassified US Army reports describe soldiers at Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland being exposed to mustard gas under voluntary programs. Though many had been pressured into participation, Canadian troops stationed in Suffield, Alberta underwent similar trials with records showing exposures to mustard gas and nerve agents. Together, these programs formed a transatlantic web of human experimentation, justified by the looming threat of Nazi chemical attacks, but executed with scant regard for the rights or welfare of those involved. The ethical betrayal is profound. These men were not prisoners of war or enemy combatants. They were volunteers, conscripts, and patriots who believed they were serving their nations honorably. Instead, they were deceived into becoming test subjects in programs shrouded in secrecy. The betrayal continued long after the war's end, as governments denied their suffering, withheld medical records, and resisted compensation claims. Even when fragments of the truth began to surface, officials framed the experiments as defensive research, minimizing the pain inflicted on those who had trusted them. Physical remnants of the trials lingered as well. Gruinard Island remained uninhabitable until 1986, when a massive decontamination effort was finally undertaken, spraying the soil with formaldehyde and seawater. Porton Down itself continued to operate in secrecy throughout the Cold War, its legacy intertwined with controversies surrounding nerve agents like sarin and VX. For many veterans, the silence persisted until death, their stories unspoken, their scars unexplained. Reading the declassified records, one is struck by the cold precision of the language compared to the suffering it masks. Terms like mild ocular irritation describe men blinded by chemical burns. Phrases like subject expired reduce a soldier's death to a footnote in a report. Behind every statistic lies a human being who trusted his government, only to be sacrificed in the pursuit of knowledge and strategic superiority. This disconnect between bureaucratic detachment and human cost is perhaps the most haunting element of all. The hidden chemical tests on Allied soldiers challenge the narrative of noble sacrifice and honorable leadership often attached to the war. They reveal a darker truth, that in the name of survival and superiority, even democratic governments were willing to betray their own. The secrecy was deliberate, the suffering real, and the silence enforced. Today, Memorial plaques and belated apologies offer a fraction of recognition, but they cannot undo the decades of denial endured by those who lived and died under the shadow of Porton Down. Within the archives, stamped "most secret," the files remain as a chilling testament to how far governments will go to keep dangerous knowledge hidden, not from the enemy, but from their own people. Chapter 5. Disturbing Secrets of Operation Sunrise Negotiations. As the war in Europe staggered toward its bloody conclusion in early 1945, secret meetings began in neutral Switzerland, meetings that, for decades, were buried beneath layers of classification and diplomatic silence, codenamed Operation Sunrise. These negotiations brought together representatives of the United States Office of Strategic Services, led by Alan Dulles, and emissaries of the Waffen-SS, most notably General Karl Wolff. Officially, the goal was to secure the surrender of German forces in northern Italy. In reality, the files reveal a darker dimension: covert bargains struck without Soviet knowledge, deals that traded leniency for intelligence, and clandestine arrangements that allowed high-ranking Nazis to escape both justice and retribution. The surviving OSS transcripts describe the first contacts in March 1945. Held in a secluded villa near Zurich, Wolff, a close associate of Heinrich Himmler, sought to negotiate the orderly surrender of German troops in Italy to avoid the destruction of cities like Milan and Genoa. Yet the conversations quickly moved beyond military logistics. Declassified memos indicate that Wolff dangled offers of intelligence on Soviet troop movements, safe passage for German officers, and promises of cooperation against communism in exchange for favorable treatment. The American negotiators, while cautious, entertained these discussions, calculating that the collapse of German resistance in Italy was worth the risk of clandestine compromise. What makes Operation Sunrise so disturbing is not that negotiations occurred, but that they were deliberately concealed from the Soviet Union, an ally still locked in savage combat on the Eastern Front. Stalin, when he learned of the talks through intercepted communications, erupted in fury, accusing the West of plotting a separate peace. Declassified Kremlin files reveal his deep mistrust of Churchill and Roosevelt, fueled by reports that the Americans were quietly considering how to harness surrendered German officers for the coming struggle against the USSR. The incident poisoned Allied relations, planting seeds of suspicion that would blossom into the Cold War within months of Germany's defeat. The archival evidence also points to the darker bargains made during these Swiss meetings. Wolff and his entourage were never prosecuted at Nuremberg for their central roles in the SS. Instead, Wolff served a relatively short prison sentence in post-war Germany before living comfortably for decades. The leniency he received has long been linked to the intelligence he provided during Operation Sunrise, including details about Soviet operations and German underground escape networks. American files marked Eyes Only suggest that Wolff, in return for immunity, facilitated contacts between OSS officers and other SS officials seeking to save themselves from Soviet capture. These negotiations effectively opened escape corridors that were later exploited by Nazi fugitives heading to Spain, South America, and the Middle East. The secrecy of Operation Sunrise extended beyond the immediate war. For years, official histories framed it as a clean and decisive success, a straightforward surrender negotiated by clever Allied officers. Only with the gradual declassification of OSS and CIA records did the troubling dimensions emerge. Reports reveal that entire convoys of German personnel and their families were allowed to move unimpeded through Allied lines, often carrying assets looted from occupied Europe. In some cases, these movements coincided with the disappearance of sensitive files and coded banking instructions later traced to accounts in Switzerland and Argentina. Whether these were deliberate concessions or calculated oversights remains unclear, but the result was undeniable. Many who should have faced justice at Nuremberg escaped into obscurity. The Soviet response to Sunrise was not merely rhetorical. Declassified Red Army orders show that Stalin accelerated offensives in Austria and Czechoslovakia, determined to seize as much territory as possible before further secret deals could rob him of spoils. This frantic push contributed to the ferocious final battles of the war, where tens of thousands died in weeks when peace was already within reach. Thus, the concealed negotiations in Switzerland arguably prolonged the suffering of Europe, not shortened it, as Allied propaganda would later suggest. The figure of Alan Dulles looms large in the Sunrise Files. Then head of OSS operations in Switzerland, he would later become the longest-serving director of the CIA, shaping American covert policy during the Cold War. His willingness to negotiate directly with SS officials in 1945 foreshadowed the realpolitik compromises that would define intelligence work for decades. For Dulles, the value of intelligence and strategic positioning outweighed moral clarity. The files reveal his handwritten notes emphasizing utility over judgment when evaluating German officers, a philosophy that carried over into the recruitment of former Nazis during Cold War intelligence programs. The moral ambiguity of Operation Sunrise lies in its dual nature. On the one hand, the surrender of German forces in Italy undoubtedly saved lives and prevented further destruction. On the other, it established a precedent that even the most notorious perpetrators of the regime could bargain their way to safety if they possessed assets valuable to the victors. Justice was not blind, it was negotiable. And those negotiations were hidden from public view, buried in archives, their details redacted until the late 20th century. Today, the villas in Switzerland where the talks occurred still stand, their walls silent witnesses to whispered conversations that altered the course of post-war Europe. In the archives of the United States, Britain and Russia, fragments of transcripts, coded cables, and diplomatic protests tell a story that official histories long ignored. They reveal that even in the war's final moments, when victory was assured, governments were already maneuvering for the next conflict, calculating alliances and striking forbidden bargains. Operation Sunrise was not just the prelude to peace in Italy. It was the dawn of a new kind of war, one fought not only on battlefields but in the shadows of negotiation and betrayal. The disturbing secrets of Operation Sunrise remind us that the end of war is never simple. For every public ceremony of surrender, there are hidden agreements, redacted files, and silent corridors where decisions are made beyond the reach of accountability. The files we possess expose only part of the story. Many remain classified, tucked away in vaults under the justification of national security. But the fragments we do know are enough to cast doubt on the purity of victory in 1945. Behind the photographs of cheering crowds and the headlines of unconditional surrender lay a quieter reality, one in which justice could be bartered, enemies could become assets, and the line between ally and adversary blurred before the smoke of war had even cleared. The war ended in fire and celebration, with parades in liberated cities and headlines proclaiming unconditional surrender. Yet behind the cheering crowds and waving flags, there remained another history, one deliberately concealed, buried deep within the vaults of intelligence agencies, church archives, and sealed state files. The 5 cases we have uncovered here are not aberrations, but fragments of a larger truth, that even in the so-called good war, governments, institutions and leaders made compromises so dark they could not be admitted in daylight. Unit 731's atrocities were not punished but repurposed. The Vatican's sacred neutrality masked forbidden pacts and escape routes. The Katyn massacres were erased, their victims silenced by both their killers and their allies. Soldiers who swore allegiance were betrayed in laboratories of chemical warfare. And even in the final hours of the conflict, secret negotiations betrayed the spirit of Allied unity, feeding the mistrust that ignited the Cold War. These secrets remind us that history is not a fixed narrative, but a contested battlefield, one where truth itself can be suppressed, falsified, or traded away. The question that lingers is chilling. If these files remained hidden for so long, what else still lies locked in vaults, stamped with the words, "most secret"? The past is never fully buried. It waits deep inside the archives, ready to surface when the silence finally breaks.